Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Welcome to another video. Let's discuss ColecoVision. Let's do a bit of a deep dive into my history. Not going to bore you with my Christmas story. I've already discussed that on numerous occasions. Let's talk about what it was like owning, playing, and collecting for ColecoVision back in 1982 when I got my system, and in 83. Specifically, I'm going to discuss just the culture and four of my friends in high school who also had ColecoVisions and a bunch of games and even accessories. Pretty awesome stuff, guys. So grab your popcorn, kick back, relax, and let's check it out. Okay, so let's discuss four of my friends, beginning with Johnny Holloway. He was my best friend for many years growing up. I was in fourth grade and he was second grade when we met. Our brothers introduced us and basically had us fight each other. Boy, those were the days, the good old 70s. And I proceeded to beat the tar out of Johnny because I was just doing what the big kid said. And he cried, and I'm sure I felt bad, but we were basically best friends ever since and still keep in touch to this day. Pretty great stuff. He was actually the best man in my wedding. Anyway, auspicious beginnings. So like myself, Johnny got a ColecoVision very early on in the life of the system, and he got quite a few games for it when it was all said and done. I think he had around 20, a little over 20, perhaps 30, when he, pretty much went on to other things. He didn't progress to the NES and the Genesis and the Super Nintendo and everything else like I did. He pretty much stopped after the ColecoVision, and then later on when he had kids, he would play their game systems with them, that kind of thing, but he doesn't really become a lifelong gamer like I did. Obviously, like I did, but not so much with him. He had other interests outside of that. But he was a big-time ColecoVision fan, and we did play a lot of ColecoVision together, and he loved the games. I remember one time I went over to his house, and they were having some kind of birthday party at his house, and he had his ColecoVision hooked up, and a friend of his, Glenn, sat there and played Jumpman Jr. pretty much the entire party. That's how compelling and addicting that game was. And when I would hang out at Johnny's house, I would frequently spend the night, and just because we just wanted to keep hanging out and listen to records and hanging out with his brother as well. We'd go swimming. We would play quite a bit of ColecoVision, and we would listen to Pink Floyd's The Wall all night long and just hang out. It was so much fun. But yeah, like I said, he did not go on to become a big gamer. Once his ColecoVision days were over, and he was just kind of tired of it, he just basically put it up in the attic. And then years later, we were discussing it, and he just gave me his system and his games. This was probably about 18 years ago, when he just gave me all his stuff that he just stumbled across in his attic. He played with his kids a few times, and they thought it was kind of fun and interesting, but they had no interest in playing it beyond just the curiosity point. That was Johnny. Definitely a big-time ColecoVision fan back in the day, and we would go to the arcades and stuff, played a lot of Mario Brothers together, the original two-player from 83. That was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of laughs. And later, when I got my NES and my excellent Mario Brothers port for the NES, I thought Johnny would want to play and we could recreate those arcade experiences, but he'd pretty much moved beyond gaming at that point. Let's get to Bill Pritchett. This was another dear friend of mine in junior high school. We became friends in junior high school. He was a hardcore football player. I was a hardcore basketball player. So we sort of bonded over sports, and we would play football together at his apartments out, tackle football over grass and concrete. It was not super brilliant thing to do, but we had a lot of fun. But we played ColecoVision, and Bill loved Venture. He would play it for hours and hours, and he got to where he could master the game even on the harder levels. And he could play, hours on a single quarter, a single play. He could play for a very long time, and he became absolutely great at that. And he pretty much left gaming after ColecoVision, as far as I know. He didn't do much gaming beyond that. We haven't really discussed gaming much beyond that. hardcore concert goer, hardcore music fan, loves rock and roll and heavy metal, loves reading Stephen King. He was a Stephen King reader big time and loved reading novels. He wasn't a comic book fan growing up, but when we were in high school, I would tell him about comic books. He had zero interest, but then I introduced him to comics with Crisis on Infinite Earths and Web of Spider-Man and all this kind of stuff. He became such a hardcore comic book fan that he actually bought a copy of Amazing Fantasy number 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man, and went on to just acquire a massive collection of comic books, and he added comic book reading to his love of reading novels. And he amassed a really big collection of ColecoVision games, including peripherals like the roller controller, the super action controller, the driving module, and he had a bunch of games and accessories. And he ended up giving every bit of that to my nephew. Not to me, to my nephew, because I already had most of the stuff. Now, he had a couple of rare games, Cubert's Cubes and Illusions, that I didn't have in my collection, and I didn't have it in my heart to remove these two games and put them in my collection. I'm not going to steal from my nephew, but he gave this stuff to my young nephew, who was kind of overwhelmed. My young nephew had played some Atari 2600 at that point, quite a bit, because his grandmother got him an Atari 2600, got their family one, and he liked Demon Attack and Pac-Man and some other games. And he was really overwhelmed by this. As you can see by this photo, he just looks kind of stunned. But we did play a lot of ColecoVision growing up. When my nephew was little and I was a teenager, we would play a lot of ColecoVision, and with my brother-in-law and niece as well, his dad and sister, at family gatherings and whatnot. We'd just go back in my bedroom and play a ton of Pepper 2, Mousetrap, Donkey Kong Jr., Omega Race, all kinds of fun games, and it was super awesome. Mr. Do, of course, and great memories playing ColecoVision with my nephew. I think that collection of games is probably still at Chris's dad's house, that collection that was given to my nephew from Bill to Chris, my nephew. And Chris, he's still a gamer to this day. He likes the modern stuff. Unlike Bill, I don't think Bill does much gaming anymore, but Bill had an amazing ColecoVision collection, and it was super generous of him to give all these games, this big collection, to my nephew. Now, this was back when the stuff really wasn't worth anything, but it was still very generous and very cool. He could have, at least sold it to a pawn shop. So Bill, great friend. We shared a lot in common once he started reading comic books especially, but we both loved playing sports. We both loved Stephen King. We both loved going to concerts. We went to tons of concerts together. And so we used to talk about the C's of life, ColecoVision, chicks, concerts, and comic books, all the great stuff starting with C. Anyway, let's get on to Eric Fresh. This guy was on my basketball team, and in 10th grade, he was one of my best friends. In high school, in 11th grade, we were still good friends as well, all through high school, but we really hung out a lot in 10th grade, and he had a ColecoVision, and I believe he got his for Christmas, but he actually worked at Sears while we were in high school, and Sears is a great place to get ColecoVision games back in the day. It was also a great place for concert tickets, and Eric he liked his ColecoVision, was a big fan. I don't think it turned him into a hardcore gamer like it did me, but we would trade games that we did. He would have some games that I didn't have, a couple of titles, and vice versa. We would trade. We'd bring them to school and trade. And like I said, we were on the basketball team together and bonded over that for sure, especially on road trips. Back in the day, riding the bus to road trips, sometimes the games were 20, 30, 40 minutes away, like over in Dallas or whatever. And on the bus, a lot of us would have Walkmans, like the portable little stereos with a radio, and some of them had cassette players. But we would tune into the radio. Everybody sitting all over the bus in different places had our Walkmans on, and we would motion the name of the radio station if a good song came on, like Q102 would go 102, and if it was a great song that was popular at the time, something by Duran Duran or Men at Work or whatever, or maybe that might occasionally play an Ozzy song or something that we thought was awesome, so we would do that. So Eric Fresh, a great friend of mine, and a funny concert story real quick. So throughout my high school time in high school, I went to tons of concerts. Most of my seats were nosebleed because those are the ones the good seats would sell out quickly, and by the time I would get my tickets, they would be, sometimes I would have lower deck, sometimes I would have floor seats, but a lot of times they were upper deck. Well, years later, after high school, Eric told me that he worked at Sears when we were in 11th and 12th grade. Now, I didn't know that back then. He probably could have gotten me a discount on ColecoVision games, and he definitely could have reserved me some really great concert tickets because he worked at Sears. Sears was a primo spot for getting concert tickets before you could just get online and get them. And, like Peaches Records sold concert tickets, record stores, Sound Warehouse, and also Sears. It was a great place for concert tickets. And I would, go to Sears and stand in line or whatever. I would go to record stores and stand in line, get my tickets. But if I'd have known Eric, by 11th and 12th grade, we weren't as tight as we were in 10th grade. And for whatever reason, we never discussed his place of occupation at Sears because we just weren't as tight then. And if I would have known, I could have had incredible seats, probably top 10, top 20 rows for all those shows I went to back in the day when usually I was kind of far away. Anyway, Eric Fresh, cool guy, but ColecoVision did not turn him into a hardcore gamer. But anyway, next up, last but not least, and after I talk about this guy, Brian Wood, another guy on my basketball team, I'm going to talk a little bit about just ColecoVision in general, the culture of it during this time. Brian Wood, he was also on my basketball team, and he was a good friend of mine. He also liked art. Now, Brian Wood bought comic books. Now, back in 1982, 83, 84, 85, you did not dare tell anyone, at least in Texas where I was, that you read comic books. They would think you were a low-grade moron. Video games, on the other hand, were considered cool, I guess because of the technology, modern or whatever, and because you could play them in the arcades, and arcades were considered cool. But for whatever reason, playing video games was considered cool. Comic books, no way. So I didn't tell anybody at school except my very closest friends. And for Brian bought comic books strictly for the art because he was an artist. We had art class together. He was a very good artist. He won some ribbons and stuff, got some first place designations and stuff, awards, different art shows. Very good artist, good basketball player. And his ColecoVision fandom, he didn't have as many games as I did or as Johnny did or Bill or Eric. He had a few. He would tire of his games pretty quickly. After he had played them enough to get pretty good at them and to kind of get the idea, he didn't stick with them over time like I did, where I'd want to keep upping my score or maybe play it, a year later. Once he got tired of a game, he would get rid of it. And this was good for me because I would buy games from him secondhand. Two in particular come to mind. Miner 2049er and Zaxxon. Those were both $50 games back in the day. Most ColecoVision games, you could walk in to Toys R Us or Sears or KB Toys, Kmart, whatever, and buy them for $30. They were typically $29.99. Every once in a while, they'd have a sale. I've told you guys about War Room. Once they had it for like $23 in the newspaper. I rushed out to get it because it was so cheap, and it was actually a pretty good game. But most games were $30, and this was before they started showing up at garage sales and things for the most part, or pawn shops. This was when ColecoVision was pretty new, and it was really hard to find secondhand games. And I bought his copy of Zaxxon and his copy of Miner 2049er at a reduced price. I believe I paid 20 or 30 bucks a piece for them, which was good at the time because they were 50 bucks new in store, so that was a good deal. Brian Wood, casual ColecoVision fan who would grow tired of his games pretty quickly. Now, speaking of growing tired, a lot of people back in the day would get tired of these games because they were kind of simple, at least relative to something today like The Last of Us. But it's kind of weird. So a modern game that's super immersive, that you might, like a modern RPG or a first-person shooter that you just spend many, many hours on. A lot of times these older games, people would play them for a few minutes or maybe a couple of days or a weekend or something and say, okay, I get it. There's a few screens and I'm done. I get it. It was kind of fun while it lasted and I kind of had fun getting good at it or whatever, but I'm done. It's simple. There's not much to it. But then some people like me would find these games completely fascinating, and I just tried again and again and again to get my high score, to push it out there higher and higher and higher, and even over the years. So there's a difference of opinion on what these older games were like even back then. some people would grow tired of them pretty quickly. And I remember some people saying, especially like with Atari 2600 stuff, they would get a game and be kind of disappointed with it, especially some of this third-party stuff that wasn't that great. But let's get back to ColecoVision. As far as the controller goes, it was kind of, people had mixed emotions about the controller, mixed feelings about the controller. Some people thought the joystick was too stubby and the side buttons would kind of cramp your hands, and they preferred, in a lot of cases, people preferred the Atari 2600 button because you could, the thumb didn't get as tired as it did on the side buttons, just pushing it on top, and it had a joystick. In the arcades, we were used to most games having joysticks, not a little stubby with a round thing on top like the ColecoVision. So I remember a lot of people talking about how they preferred the Atari 2600 joysticks more, and a lot of people, friends of mine and just people I knew in general, would upgrade to the Super Action controller because it had a proper joystick, even with a red ball on top, like a lot of arcade games had the ball top. So anyway, it's still kind of tiring to push these buttons. The keypad on top of the Super Action controller and on the ColecoVision controller, these were widely well received back in the day. People liked the option to have more buttons, and some later ColecoVision games had pause that you could utilize with the keyboard. And just a game like Mousetrap with the color-coded doors, the keypad was perfect for it. It was very well received for the most part. In general, the ColecoVision was considered a vast upgrade over the Atari 2600, Odyssey 2, and Intellivision, which it was, especially with the graphics and the music, just mind-blowing. You don't get that upgrading from the PS4 to the PS5. You just don't feel that visceral impact of, wow, this is a game changer. This is incredible. I didn't know this was possible at home. Now, if you were to jump from the PS1 with the blocky, 3D graphics and, some of those early PS1 games didn't look great, the 3D titles. If you went from PS1 to PS5, you might get a little bit of an idea of the advance. There was just nothing quite like going from those blocky Atari 2600 games to the ColecoVision. It was night and day, and it was just astonishing to be able to play cartoon-like games like Donkey Kong Jr., like Smurfs. Playing these cartoon-like games at home on a home console was just life-altering, really. It was amazing, and it was just so cool and so much fun. Another thing the ColecoVision did, it made the Atari 2600 suddenly irrelevant for a lot of people and suddenly uncool. Now, there were some people like me who still loved the 2600 because you had certain experiences on it that you couldn't get with the ColecoVision, like games with a paddle controller, like Circus Atari and Warlords, the great control of the paddle controller. There were some games that hadn't come out yet for the ColecoVision, or that never came out for the ColecoVision. The Atari 2600 had such a vast library, which I really appreciated. And for me, I kept my Atari so I got my ColecoVision first, then my Atari 2600, but that was a little backwards. Most of the people I knew that got a ColecoVision had an Atari 2600 already, but I've told you guys we didn't get one because it was so expensive. My parents weren't going to shell out that kind of cash for an Atari 2600, so I had to go play it at my friends' houses. But anyway, when ColecoVision came out, I still loved the systems before it, still loved the older systems, but a lot of people didn't. A lot of people suddenly saw the older stuff as uncool, kind of like when Nirvana came in with grunge and suddenly hair metal was uncool, kind of like when The Exorcist came out in 1973. Suddenly the Universal monsters didn't seem so cool. When Halloween came out, suddenly Frankenstein and Dracula didn't seem so cool or so scary because things got really realistic. Kind of a stretch of an analogy, but it was definitely a culture-altering, a pop culture-altering, a mind-blowing situation where you suddenly had games that were very arcade-like for really sophisticated arcade games at the time. Now, another interesting phenomenon around the ColecoVision was discovering really cool arcade games for the very first time. Now, growing up, I was a hardcore arcade gamer. Land of Oz, Aladdin's Castle. These were both at the mall. Some random mall arcades, occasionally when we'd go out of town, like to visit cousins or whatever. Malibu Grand Prix, just a vast, beautiful playground of arcade games. and snack bar and pool tables and pinball machines. Just incredible, huge place. Putt golf and games, several locations around. Movie theaters, arcade games were everywhere, and I could afford a quarter here and there, and I could find, I could play games at the arcades when I couldn't afford a 2600. But anyway, loved growing up playing in the arcades, and I would hang out at arcades a lot. But there were definitely games for the ColecoVision that I never saw before on this system that I absolutely ended up loving. Now, games like Space Panic, the climbing game or non-scrolling platformer, never saw that in the arcades. I never saw Venture once. I would see all kinds of interesting arcade games, some unusual stuff that you don't hear about much today, but not Venture, not in my area. Pepper 2, one of my favorite video games of all time to this day, Pepper 2 on the ColecoVision, which you still don't see in arcade form very often. Back in the day, I never saw the arcade version. I haven't played it until recently with the phenomenon of retro arcades and gaming conventions. So there were a lot of games for the ColecoVision, like looping, that you just did not see in the arcades. And that was an amazing aspect of the system, that you would get really good arcade ports of games like Ladybug, of games like Mousetrap. Now, I did play a lot of Mousetrap at the Land of Oz arcade, and I love the color-coded buttons on the ColecoVision, the little overlay like I'd said. Phenomenal port, maybe the best port for the ColecoVision just in terms of accuracy. It was super cool to play these arcade games at home, and it was really interesting to discover these new titles like Victory. Just amazing. Great stuff. ColecoVision altered the course of gaming at the time. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough to keep console gaming going through the Great Crash. There were too many factors against it, and I've talked about the crash on this channel before. So before I get too long-winded, I'm going to wrap this up. I want to know from you guys, especially you old-timers, young people too, your perception of ColecoVision now. But you old-timers, let me know what it was like for you playing ColecoVision back in 82, 83, 84. An interesting time. Pre-NES gaming is absolutely fascinating. It was an interesting time to grow up, and I would love to hear your stories of gaming at this time. One thing I'm reminded of by my t-shirt, when Pitfall came out for the ColecoVision, we were excited, but we were a little disappointed that the graphics didn't look cartoon-like like the Smurfs or Donkey Kong. We thought Activision dropped the ball a little bit for a lot of their ports. Some would add certain things, but they looked a little too much like their 2600 versions. Another story for another day. Maybe I'll do a comparison video sometime. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Thank you for liking this video. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. It's so important. It is so cool of you guys for checking out my channel. It's just amazing. I'm having so much fun. And let me know in the comments your ColecoVision stories. We will talk to you in another video.
It's me, Mario!